The slap echoed across the naval base cafeteria like a gunshot. Captain Marcus Thornfield's hand connected with the woman's face so hard that conversation stopped mid-sentence. Forks froze halfway to mouths, and even the kitchen staff peered through the serving window in stunned silence. What he didn't know, what none of them knew, was that the quiet mess hall worker he had just struck was Lieutenant Commander Elena Vasquez, a decorated Navy SEAL who had spent the last 8 years eliminating high-value targets in the most dangerous corners of the world. The captain was about to learn that some people you should never, ever lay a hand on. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. But let's go back to the beginning, 3 months earlier. When Elena first arrived at Naval Station Blackwater, meet Elena Vasquez. 29 years old, with shoulder-length black hair usually pulled back in a simple ponytail. Olive skin that spoke of her Mexican heritage, and dark brown eyes that seemed to absorb everything while revealing nothing. She stood about 5'6" with a lean, athletic build that most people assumed came from casual fitness routines. When she applied for the civilian food service position at Naval Station Blackwater in San Diego, her application was unremarkable, just another former military member transitioning to civilian work. The base was a sprawling complex that housed over 8,000 personnel, from fresh-faced recruits to seasoned officers. Naval Station Blackwater prided itself on being one of the most prestigious assignments on the West Coast, home to advanced tactical training programs and elite unit preparations. The social hierarchy was rigid and unforgiving, especially in the massive main cafeteria where Elena had been assigned to work. Elena's supervisor was a career civilian named Mrs. Dorothy Chun, a no-nonsense woman in her 50s who had been running food services at military bases for over 2 decades. "Keep your head down, do your work, and don't cause waves," Mrs. Chun had advised on Elena's first day. Some of these officers can be demanding, especially Captain Thornfield. He runs the Advanced Combat Training Division and thinks he owns the place. Captain Marcus Thornfield was exactly the type of officer Elena had encountered countless times throughout her military career. Mid-40s, perfectly pressed uniform, graying temples that he thought made him look distinguished, and an ego that filled every room he entered. He had spent most of his career in administrative and training roles, never seeing actual combat, but he carried himself with the swagger of a war hero. His division was responsible for preparing elite units for deployment. Though he personally had never been deployed anywhere more dangerous than a Pentagon briefing room, from her first week, Elena noticed how Thornfield treated the civilian staff. He would snap his fingers to get attention, never used please or thank you, and had a particular disdain for the female employees. "Sweetheart, my coffee's cold," he'd bark at the women behind the serving counter. "Princess, where's my usual table?" He'd demand when his preferred seating wasn't immediately available. Elena worked the main serving line during lunch hours, the busiest time when over 1,000 personnel would cycle through the cafeteria. She ladled portions, refilled containers, and wiped down surfaces with the same methodical efficiency she brought to everything in her life. Her movements were economical, precise, almost mechanical in their consistency. Most people barely noticed her. She was just another face in navy blue work clothes and a hairnet, but Elena noticed everything. She observed the base's security protocols, memorized shift changes, and unconsciously cataloged the behavioral patterns of key personnel. Old habits from her SEAL training died hard, even when she was serving mashed potatoes and green beans. Her mind automatically assessed entries and exits, noted which officers carried sidearms and which didn't, and tracked the general flow of personnel throughout the facility. The other food service workers were a mix of military spouses, retirees, and civilians looking for steady government employment. There was Maria Santos, a chatty grandmother whose husband had served 3 tours in Afghanistan. Jake Morrison, a former Army cook who'd lost his leg to an IED and now walked with a slight limp. And Susan Parker, a quiet woman in her 40s whose son was deployed with the Marines. They were good people who took pride in feeding the men and women who served their country, preparing and narrating. This story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. Elena fit in well enough with her co-workers, though she kept to herself more than the others. During breaks, while the others shared stories about their families or complained about difficult customers, Elena would sit quietly with a book or simply observe the controlled chaos of the cafeteria. Her co-workers respected her work ethic. She never called in sick, always arrived early, and never left until every surface was spotless. She's reliable, Mrs. Chun would tell anyone who asked about Elena. Doesn't talk much, but she gets the job done right the first time. Wish I had 10 more like her. What none of them knew was that Elena wore a small, discreet chain around her neck, hidden beneath her work uniform. On that chain hung her seal trident pin and 2 small metal tokens, one marking her completion of Hell Week, another commemorating a classified mission in Syria where her unit had successfully extracted a kidnapped diplomat while eliminating a 12-man terrorist. Elena had requested this assignment specifically. After 8 years of high-stakes operations, constant deployments, and the kind of stress that ages you beyond your years, she needed to disappear for a while. The food service job at Blackwater was perfect, stable, anonymous, and completely beneath the notice of anyone who might recognize her from her previous life. She had no intention of causing trouble, drawing attention, or reminding anyone that she was anything more than a former military member trying to make an honest living in civilian clothes. Elena just wanted to serve food, collect her paycheck, and figure out what came next in her life. Unfortunately, Captain Marcus Thornfield was about to make that impossible. Within her first month at Naval Station Blackwater, Elena had unknowingly earned herself a reputation among both the food service staff and the military personnel who frequented the cafeteria. The other civilian workers had started calling her the robot behind her back, not out of malice, but because of her unnaturally precise movements and complete lack of emotional reaction to even the most difficult customers. I swear, that girl doesn't have a single nerve in her body, Maria Santos would whisper to the other workers during their afternoon break. Yesterday, Lieutenant Brooks threw his entire tray back at her because his steak was overcooked, and she just cleaned it up like nothing happened. Didn't even blink. Jake Morrison, a former Army cook, had his own theory. She's got that 1,000-yard stare, you know. I've seen it in guys who've been downrange. But she's just food service, right? Maybe she's just one of those people who doesn't show emotion. Susan Parker was more direct in her assessment. Robot or not, I'm glad she's here. Ever since Elena started on the lunch shift, the officers have been less handsy with the rest of us. It's like they focus all their attitude on her instead. This observation was more accurate than Susan realized. Elena had indeed become a lightning rod for the worst behavior from the base's more problematic officers. She seemed to attract their attention in ways that puzzled her co-workers, but made perfect sense from a psychological standpoint. Her complete lack of reaction to their power plays only encouraged them to escalate their behavior. Captain Thornfield had taken particular notice of Elena after an incident in her 3rd week. He had been explaining loudly to his lunch companions about the proper way to handle insurgents in urban combat scenarios, a topic he had never experienced firsthand but spoke about with absolute authority. When Elena had quietly refilled his water glass without being asked, he had stopped mid-sentence and stared at her. "You know, gentlemen," he had said, loud enough for the surrounding tables to hear, "this is exactly what I mean about situational awareness. Our little lunch lady here just demonstrated perfect peripheral vision and anticipation. Too bad we can't teach that kind of instinct to our actual combat personnel." The other officers had chuckled politely, but Elena had noticed something in Thornfield's tone, a condescending appreciation that made her skin crawl. From that day forward, he seemed to go out of his way to interact with her, always in ways that demonstrated his authority and her subservience. "Coffee girl," he would call out when he entered the cafeteria, even though Elena worked the main serving line, not the beverage station. "Make sure my usual table is clean. And I mean spotless, I can see fingerprints from here." When Elena would dutifully clean his preferred table, a corner spot that gave him a clear view of the entire cafeteria, Thornfield would run his finger along the surface afterward, examining it for imaginary flaws. "Better," he would announce to no one in particular. "Standards, people. It's all about maintaining standards." The ritual became a daily performance. Thornfield would arrive for lunch precisely at 12:15 hours, scan the cafeteria until he located Elena, and then begin his routine of subtle humiliation disguised as military discipline. He never raised his voice or used profanity that would have been beneath an officer of his stature. Instead, he employed the kind of psychological warfare that career military personnel had perfected over generations. "Tell me, lunch lady," he said one afternoon while Elena was wiping down nearby tables, "have you ever wondered what real military training looks like? The kind that separates the warriors from the ... He gestured vaguely at her uniform. "Support personnel?" Elena had continued cleaning without acknowledgement, her movements steady and methodical. Her silence only seemed to encourage him. "I run advanced combat scenarios every day," Thornfield continued, his voice carrying to the surrounding tables. "Life and death situations that would break most people. But I suppose everyone contributes in their own way, right? Some people storm enemy positions, others serve meatloaf." The other officers at his table had shifted uncomfortably. Even among military personnel who understood the importance of hierarchy and discipline, Thornfield's treatment of the civilian staff was excessive. But he was a captain, he ran an important division, and challenging him publicly would be career suicide for junior officers. Lieutenant Sarah Chun, no relation to the food service supervisor, was one of the few people who regularly spoke up. "Sir, maybe we should focus on today's training schedule," she would suggest whenever Thornfield's commentary became particularly pointed. As one of the few female officers in his division, Lieutenant Chun understood the dynamics of workplace harassment better than most, but Elena never asked for intervention, never showed signs of distress, and never complained to her supervisor. Her complete lack of reaction had become legendary among the cafeteria staff. New employees were warned about Captain Thornfield and told to watch how Elena handled him. "Learn from the robot," Mrs. Chun would tell newcomers. "Don't take the bait, don't give them ammunition, and never let them see you sweat. Elena's got it figured out." What Mrs. Chun and the others didn't understand was that Elena's behavior wasn't the result of patience or professional discipline. It was the automatic response of someone who had spent years in situations where the wrong reaction could mean death. In the mountains of Afghanistan, the wrong facial expression could blow your cover. In the streets of Syria, the wrong body language could compromise an entire mission. Emotional control wasn't just a skill for Elena, it was a survival mechanism that had been drilled into her through some of the most brutal training the U.S. military had to offer. The base's younger personnel had their own nickname for her: Ghost. The name had started when a group of junior enlisted men noticed how Elena seemed to appear and disappear around the cafeteria without making a sound. She would be cleaning tables in one section, then suddenly be behind the serving line refilling containers, then wiping down surfaces near the entrance, all without anyone noticing her movement between positions. "It's like she teleports," Petty Officer James Rodriguez had joked to his friends. "One second she's over there, next second she's right behind you. Freaky." The nickname had spread throughout the younger ranks, though they used it with a mixture of respect and unease. There was something about Elena that made even the cockiest young sailors think twice before getting too familiar with her. She radiated a subtle energy that suggested crossing her would be a mistake. Even though none of them could articulate exactly why they felt that way, the irony was that Elena had become simultaneously invisible and highly visible. The officers saw her as a target for their power games. The staff saw her as an enigma, and the junior personnel saw her as something slightly supernatural. But none of them saw her for what she actually was. That blindness was about to cost Captain Thornfield everything. 3 weeks into Elena's employment at Naval Station Blackwater, the base hosted its annual emergency response training exercise. The scenario was designed to test how well different departments could coordinate during a crisis, everything from medical emergencies to security breaches. What started as a routine drill would become Elena's first unavoidable moment in the spotlight. The exercise began at 0800 hours on a Tuesday morning with a simulated chemical spill in the main administration building. Personnel from various departments were assigned roles as either responders or casualties, creating a controlled chaos that tested communication systems, evacuation procedures, and emergency medical protocols. Elena and the other food service workers were designated as non-essential personnel and instructed to continue normal operations while staying clear of the drill areas. Dr. Amanda Foster, the base's chief medical officer, was overseeing the medical response portion of the exercise from a command tent set up in the main courtyard. She was a 15-year Navy veteran who had seen real combat during 3 deployments to Iraq, treating everything from IED injuries to chemical exposure. Dr. Foster took these training exercises seriously because she knew that in real emergencies, muscle memory and proper procedures could mean the difference between life and death. The victims of the simulated chemical spill were played by volunteers from different departments who had been given realistic-looking injuries using special effects makeup and were instructed to display specific symptoms of chemical exposure. The medical teams responding to the scene were being evaluated on their triage decisions, decontamination procedures, and treatment protocols. Elena was working her usual lunch prep shift when she heard the first emergency sirens. Through the cafeteria's large windows, she could see medical personnel in full hazmat gear moving between the administration building and the triage area. The drill was designed to look and feel as realistic as possible, and from her vantage point, it was convincing. Everything was proceeding according to plan until Petty Officer 3rd Class Michael Torres, one of the volunteers playing a chemical exposure victim, began experiencing real distress. Torres had a previously undiagnosed sensitivity to the latex in the fake wound appliances that had been applied to his neck and arms. Within minutes of the makeup being applied, he was experiencing a severe allergic reaction that was rapidly progressing toward anaphylactic shock. The problem was that Torres's real symptoms, difficulty breathing, facial swelling, and skin discoloration, were nearly identical to the fake chemical exposure symptoms he was supposed to be displaying. The medical personnel treating him assumed his distress was part of his acting role and praised him for his realistic portrayal of a chemical burn victim. "Great job," Torres called out Hospital Corpsman 2nd Class Jennifer Park as she approached with a training mannequin stretcher. "Your breathing sounds really convincing. The wheezing is a nice touch." Torres tried to speak, to tell them this wasn't part of the drill, but his throat was closing rapidly. His attempts to communicate came out as gasps and choking sounds that the medical team interpreted as excellent acting. They loaded him onto the stretcher and began carrying him toward the decontamination area, following proper chemical exposure protocols that would waste precious minutes while his condition deteriorated. Elena was refilling the beverage dispensers near the cafeteria's main windows when she saw Torres being loaded onto the stretcher. Something about his body language immediately triggered her alarm instincts. She had seen real medical emergencies in combat zones, and there was a difference between simulated distress and genuine life-threatening crisis that couldn't be faked. Torres's hand positioning was wrong instead of the defensive, protective gestures that chemical burn victims typically displayed. He was clawing at his throat in the distinctive pattern of someone whose airway was closing. His skin color was shifting from the makeup-induced pallor to the blue-tinged cyanosis of oxygen deprivation. Most telling of all, his eye movements showed the kind of genuine panic that no amount of acting training could replicate. Elena dropped the beverage pitcher she was holding and moved toward the window for a better view. The medical team was following textbook decontamination procedures, which meant they would spend at least 10 minutes setting up proper chemical wash stations before beginning actual treatment. If Torres was experiencing anaphylactic shock, he had maybe 5 minutes before his airway closed completely. She watched as Dr. Foster approached the stretcher, clipboard in hand, ready to evaluate the medical team's response to the simulated emergency. Elena could see the exact moment when Dr. Foster realized something was wrong. The experienced combat medic's body language shifted from training observer to emergency responder in an instant, but Dr. Foster was 50 yards away from the stretcher and would need time to push through the crowd of personnel and equipment surrounding the triage area. Elena was closer, but she was a civilian food service worker who had no business involving herself in a military medical emergency. Elena made her decision in less than 2 seconds. She vaulted over the low barrier that separated the cafeteria's outdoor seating area from the main courtyard, covering the distance to the stretcher in a dead sprint that would have impressed the base's track and field coaches. The medical personnel carrying Torres barely had time to register her approach before she was beside them, her hands already moving toward Torres's neck. "Real emergency," Elena said with absolute authority, her voice carrying the kind of command presence that made people listen without question. "Anaphylactic shock. He needs epinephrine now." Hospital Corman Park started to protest. "Man, you need to stay back. This is a training exercise," and Elena's fingers found Torres's pulse point while simultaneously checking his airway. His pulse was rapid and thready, his breathing was barely detectable, and his lips were turning blue despite the makeup. She had seen these exact symptoms in a teammate who had eaten contaminated local food during a mission in Somalia. "Look at his hands," Elena commanded, grabbing Park's attention and forcing her to focus. "Real anaphylaxis. His pulse is 140 and climbing, airway restriction is severe, and he's cyanotic under the makeup. You have maybe 3 minutes." Something in Elena's tone and the clinical precision of her assessment cut through Park's confusion. The corpsman looked closer at Torres and saw what Elena had spotted from 50 yards away. This wasn't acting. "Jesus, you're right," Park breathed, immediately reaching for her emergency medical kit. "How did you?" "EpiPen, left thigh, perpendicular to the muscle," Elena instructed, her hands now supporting Torres's head in the optimal position to keep his airway open. "Then get him on oxygen and start in 4 with normal saline wide open." Park administered the epinephrine injection with shaking hands while Elena maintained airway support. Within 30 seconds, Torres's breathing began to improve, and his color started returning to normal. The speed and accuracy of Elena's diagnosis had quite literally saved his life. Dr. Foster arrived just as Torres was beginning to respond to treatment. She took one look at the scene, the civilian food worker, directing emergency medical care with obvious expertise, and immediately understood that something remarkable had just happened. "Who made the diagnosis?" Dr. Foster asked as she knelt beside the stretcher. Park gestured toward Elena, who was already stepping back now that the immediate crisis had passed. She spotted it from the cafeteria and got here before any of us realized it was real. Knew exactly what to do. Dr. Foster studied Elena with the appraising look of a medical professional recognizing another medical professional. That was textbook emergency response. Where did you learn to assess anaphylactic shock? Elena was quiet for a moment, aware that dozens of military personnel were now staring at her with expressions ranging from confusion to admiration. She had just demonstrated medical knowledge that was far beyond what anyone would expect from a cafeteria worker. Basic first aid training, Elena said simply. Though everyone present knew that basic first aid didn't cover the kind of rapid, accurate triage assessment they had just witnessed. Captain Thornfield had arrived during the commotion and was now standing at the edge of the crowd, his expression unreadable as he watched his lunch lady being praised by the base's chief medical officer. For the first time since Elena had started working at Blackwater, he was looking at her with something other than condescending amusement. The incident report would later note that Petty Officer Torres made a full recovery thanks to immediate recognition and treatment of anaphylactic shock by civilian personnel. But the report couldn't capture the questions that Elena's actions had raised among the base's medical and command staff. Someone with her level of emergency medical knowledge didn't learn those skills serving lunch in a cafeteria. In the days following the emergency response incident, Elena noticed a subtle but significant shift in how she was perceived around Naval Station Blackwater. The change wasn't universal. Most personnel still saw her as just another civilian worker, but among certain groups, particularly the medical staff and some of the more observant officers, there was a new undercurrent of curiosity that made Elena increasingly uncomfortable. Dr. Foster had made several attempts to engage Elena in conversation during her lunch rounds, asking seemingly casual questions about her medical background and previous experience. Elena deflected these inquiries with the same polite indifference she showed everyone else, but she could feel the physician's analytical gaze studying her whenever their paths crossed. You know, Dr. Foster had said just yesterday while Elena was cleaning nearby tables, I've been thinking about what happened with Torres. The way you assessed his condition so quickly, that kind of diagnostic speed usually comes from seeing a lot of medical emergencies. Have you considered applying for a position with our medical support staff? Elena had continued wiping down surfaces with methodical precision. I'm happy in food service, ma'am. Thank you for the offer. But Dr. Foster's interest had sparked conversations among other staff members, and Elena found herself under increased scrutiny from people who should have forgotten about the incident by now. The last thing she needed was attention that might lead to deeper questions about her background. Unfortunately, Captain Thornfield's reaction to Elena's moment of recognition had taken a decidedly darker turn. Rather than developing respect for her capabilities, he seemed to view her brief time in the spotlight as a challenge to his authority and an affront to the natural order of the base's hierarchy. A civilian worker, especially a female civilian worker, had no business demonstrating expertise that overshadowed military personnel. Regardless of the circumstances, the captain's daily interactions with Elena had evolved from casual condescension to what could only be described as systematic harassment. He began arriving for lunch earlier than usual, timing his visits to coincide with the busiest periods when Elena would be most visible to other personnel. His comments became more pointed, his demands more unreasonable, and his tone increasingly aggressive. Well, Thornfield announced loudly as he approached the serving line on Thursday afternoon. If it isn't our resident medical expert. Tell me, Dr. Lunchlady, what's your professional opinion on today's mystery meat? Elena served his portion without looking up, her movements efficient and emotionless. It's beef stroganoff, sir. I didn't ask what it was called, Thornfield snapped, his voice carrying across the cafeteria. I asked for your medical opinion. Surely someone with your diagnostic abilities can tell us whether this slop is fit for human consumption." The other personnel in line shifted uncomfortably. Even by Thornfield's standards, this level of public mockery was excessive. Lieutenant Chun, who was standing several people behind the captain, opened her mouth to say something, then thought better of it. Challenging a superior officer in front of enlisted personnel was a career-limiting move, regardless of the circumstances. Elena placed the serving utensil back in the container and met Thornfield's eyes for the first time. "The food meets all Navy nutritional standards and safety protocols, sir." "Standards," Thornfield repeated, savoring the word. "That's interesting, because I'm starting to wonder what standards were applied when this facility decided to hire people who clearly think they're overqualified for their positions." Mrs. Chun, who was working the adjacent serving station, cast a worried glance in Elena's direction. The food service supervisor had noticed the escalating tension between Thornfield and Elena, but she was a civilian employee with no authority to challenge a military officer's behavior. Her only option was to document incidents and hope that someone with actual authority would eventually intervene. Elena returned to serving food without responding, but Thornfield wasn't finished. He made a show of examining his tray, holding it up to the light and rotating it slowly as if inspecting for contamination. "You know what bothers me about people who get a little taste of recognition?" he continued, still addressing Elena, but speaking loud enough for the entire serving area to hear. "They start thinking they're special. They forget their place in the hierarchy. They begin to believe that one lucky guess makes them an expert." The cafeteria had grown noticeably quieter. Conversations at nearby tables had stopped as personnel realized they were witnessing something more serious than Thornfield's usual petty tyranny. Even the kitchen staff had paused their work to listen through the serving window. Elena continued her duties, ladling portions and maintaining the serving line as if Thornfield wasn't standing 3 feet away systematically attempting to humiliate her. Her complete lack of reaction only seemed to fuel his anger. "I run combat training exercises that would break most people," Thornfield said, his voice taking on a harder edge. "Real training. Life and death scenarios that separate the warriors from the pretenders. But apparently, some people think that playing doctor for 5 minutes makes them qualified to question military protocols." Lieutenant Sarah Chun had heard enough. She stepped forward, her voice carefully neutral but firm. "Sir, perhaps we should discuss today's training schedule. We have the urban warfare simulation at 1400 hours. Thornfield turned toward Chun with obvious irritation. "Lieutenant, I don't recall asking for your input on my conversation with the help." The word help landed like a slap. Even in a military environment where hierarchy was everything, reducing a fellow human being to such a dismissive term crossed a line. Several junior officers exchanged glances, clearly uncomfortable with their superior's behavior, but unwilling to risk their careers by speaking up. Elena's hands never paused in their work, but those watching closely might have noticed a subtle tension in her shoulders, the kind of physical response that suggested she was exercising considerable self-control. She had dealt with bullies before, both in and out of uniform. But Thornfield's particular brand of public humiliation was designed to provoke exactly the kind of reaction that would justify escalating his harassment. Maria Santos, who was working the dessert station, later told the other civilian workers that she had never seen anyone maintain such complete composure under that level of verbal assault. "It was like watching someone made of stone," she said. "Most people would have broken down or fought back by now." Elena just absorbed it all. The harassment campaign continued daily for the next 2 weeks. Thornfield would arrive for lunch with what appeared to be a prepared list of comments and complaints, designed to chip away at Elena's composure. He criticized her serving techniques, questioned her hygiene practices, and made increasingly personal remarks about her appearance and background. "I've been wondering," he said during one particularly vicious session, "what kind of person applies for a job serving food when they clearly think they're qualified for something better? Financial problems? Criminal background? Or just a general failure to achieve anything meaningful in life?" The other food service workers had begun timing their breaks to avoid witnessing these daily confrontations. Even the most hardened military personnel found Thornfield's behavior disturbing. But the rigid command structure made intervention nearly impossible without risking serious professional consequences. Elena endured it all with the same mechanical efficiency she brought to everything else. She served food, cleaned surfaces, and restocked supplies while Thornfield systematically attempted to destroy her dignity in front of hundreds of witnesses. Her complete lack of emotional response had become legendary among the base personnel. But it was also driving Thornfield to increasingly desperate measures. What he didn't understand was that Elena's composure wasn't the result of weakness or resignation. It was the disciplined response of someone who had been trained to withstand interrogation techniques designed by professionals. Thornfield's amateur psychological warfare was nothing compared to what Elena had endured during SEER training, where instructors had spent weeks attempting to break her will using methods that made his cafeteria harassment look like gentle teasing. But even Elena's extraordinary self-control had limits, and Captain Thornfield was about to discover exactly where those limits were. The breaking point was approaching, and when it came, Thornfield would learn that some people's patience isn't a sign of weakness, it's a warning. The truth about Elena Vasquez began on a rain-soaked beach in Coronado, California, 14 years earlier, when an 18-year-old girl with something to prove walked into the Navy recruiting station in downtown San Diego. The recruiter, Petty Officer First Class Marcus Williams, had seen thousands of young people walk through those doors, but Elena was different. She didn't fidget, didn't ask about benefits or college money, and didn't seem intimidated by the walls covered with images of ships, aircraft, and combat operations. "What do you want from the Navy?" Williams had asked, expecting the usual answers about travel, education, or family tradition. "I want to be part of something that matters," Elena had replied, her dark eyes steady and focused. "And I want to be the best at whatever I do." Williams had smiled at what he assumed was typical teenage bravado, but something in Elena's voice suggested she meant every word. 6 months later, when she graduated at the top of her basic training class and immediately volunteered for the most challenging assignments available, he realized he had been looking at something rare: a young person with both the intelligence and the steel necessary to survive the military's most demanding programs. Elena's path to becoming a Navy SEAL had been anything but typical. Women weren't officially allowed in SEAL teams when she first enlisted, but the military was quietly beginning to explore the possibilities. A small, experimental program was being developed to test whether female personnel could meet the same standards as their male counterparts in special operations roles. Elena had volunteered for the program the moment she heard about it, despite warnings from instructors and peers that the failure rate was nearly 100%. Her father, Roberto Vasquez, was a retired Marine Corps gunnery sergeant who had served 3 tours in Vietnam and understood exactly what his daughter was attempting to do. "Mia," he had told her during one of their final conversations before she left for advanced training, "the military will try to break you in ways you can't imagine. Not because they hate you, but because they need to know you won't break when lives depend on you. The question isn't whether you're tough enough. The question is whether you're smart enough to endure what's necessary to become what you need to be." The first phase of Elena's special operations training had taken place at a classified facility in Virginia, where she and 7 other female volunteers were put through a modified version of the selection process used for male SEAL candidates. The physical requirements were brutal 20-mile swims in freezing water, obstacle courses designed to test pain tolerance and mental resilience, and survival exercises that pushed participants to the edge of human endurance. Elena was the only candidate to complete the full program. Master Chief Petty Officer James Iron Mackenzie, the instructor who oversaw Elena's training, had been skeptical about the entire experimental program. A 25-year SEAL veteran with deployments in every major conflict since the 1980s, Mackenzie believed that special operations was no place for social experiments. But Elena had changed his mind through sheer, relentless competence. "I've trained over 300 SEAL candidates," Mackenzie had written in Elena's final evaluation. "Maybe 20 of them had the combination of physical ability, mental toughness, and tactical intelligence necessary to excel in special operations. Elena Vasquez is in the top 5 of that group, regardless of gender. She doesn't just meet the standards, she exceeds them." Elena's specialty became close reconnaissance and direct action operations in urban environments. Her relatively small stature and ability to blend into civilian populations made her ideal for missions that required infiltrating hostile territory without detection. Over 8 years of active service, she participated in over 40 classified operations across 3 different theaters of operation. The mission that would define Elena's career and eventually lead to her early retirement from active duty took place in a city whose name was still classified in official records. Intelligence reports indicated that a high-value target, a bomb maker responsible for attacks that had killed dozens of coalition forces, was hiding in a heavily fortified compound in the city's commercial district. Elena's team was tasked with conducting surveillance and, if the opportunity presented itself, eliminating the target. The mission required her to pose as a local shopkeeper for 3 weeks, operating a small electronics repair business that provided perfect cover for observing the target compound across the street. The operation went flawlessly for 2 weeks. Elena gathered detailed intelligence on the target's routines, security measures, and the layout of his compound. She identified the optimal time and method for elimination, and her team was preparing to execute the mission when everything went wrong. A rival terrorist faction, unaware of Elena's presence or mission, launched their own attack on the compound. The resulting firefight trapped Elena in her cover position while automatic weapons fire and explosives turned the street into a war zone. Worse, the attack had occurred during a local religious festival, and nearly 3 dozen civilians were caught in the crossfire. Elena had a choice: maintain her cover and wait for extraction, or blow her carefully constructed identity to save the civilians who were pinned down in the street between the warring factions. She chose the civilians. Elena emerged from her electronics shop with her sidearm and began systematically eliminating threats while directing civilians to safety. The mission was compromised. The target escaped in the confusion, and Elena's cover was permanently blown. But 31 civilians made it home to their families that night because a Navy SEAL chose to prioritize human life over mission objectives. The official after-action report praised Elena's tactical flexibility and commitment to minimizing civilian casualties. The unofficial conversations among her superiors were more complex. Elena had saved lives, but she had also demonstrated a willingness to prioritize her personal moral code over strict mission parameters. In special operations, that kind of independent thinking could be either a valuable asset or a dangerous liability. Captain Rachel Morrison, Elena's commanding officer, had called her into a private meeting 3 days after the mission debrief. Morrison was one of the few senior officers who fully understood the unique pressures faced by women in special operations roles. "You did the right thing," Morrison had told Elena, "but you also made a choice that put your entire team at risk. I need to know that you can live with the consequences of that choice, both professionally and personally." Elena had thought carefully before responding. "Ma'am, I became a SEAL to protect people. If I have to choose between completing a mission and saving innocent lives, I'll save the lives every time. If that makes me unsuitable for this job, then maybe this job isn't suitable for me." Morrison had studied Elena for a long moment. "You're one of the best operators I've ever worked with, Elena, but you're also carrying a weight that's going to break you eventually. Everyone in special operations learns to compartmentalize, to separate the mission from the moral implications. You never learned that skill, and I'm not sure you want to." 2 years later, after several more successful missions and a growing reputation as one of the most effective close reconnaissance specialists in the SEAL community, Elena requested transfer to inactive reserves. She was 29 years old, at the peak of her professional capabilities, and walking away from a military career that could have taken her to the highest levels of Special Operations Command. Her official reason for leaving was pursuit of civilian opportunities. The real reason was that Elena had begun to question whether she could continue to reconcile her personal values with the moral ambiguity inherent in special operations work. She had spent 8 years becoming one of the most skilled warriors in the world's most elite military force. She could eliminate targets at ranges that most people couldn't even see, operate for weeks behind enemy lines without detection, and make split-second tactical decisions under impossible pressure. But what Elena really wanted was to find a way to use those skills in service of something that didn't require her to compromise her moral compass. She wanted to protect people without having to weigh the value of individual lives against broader strategic objectives. The food service job at Naval Station Blackwater was supposed to be a temporary respite, a post of IO-espit objectives, chance to figure out what came next while earning an honest living in an environment where her past wouldn't follow her. Elena had never expected that her attempt to disappear would eventually force her to confront everything she thought she had left behind. The decision to leave active duty hadn't been sudden for Elena. It had crystallized over the course of 18 months, beginning with a mission in Eastern Europe that she still couldn't discuss with anyone who lacked the appropriate security clearances. The operation itself had been a tactical success. Her team had eliminated a weapons trafficking network that was supplying advanced explosives to terrorist organizations across 3 continents. But the aftermath had left Elena questioning everything she thought she understood about her role as a warrior. The weapons dealer they had been tracking, a man named Viktor Kozlov, had been using his teenage daughter as an unwitting courier. The girl had no knowledge of her father's activities. She simply delivered packages to various locations around the city as part of what she believed was a legitimate family business. When Elena's team moved to apprehend Kozlov, the girl had been present in the safe house, organizing shipping manifests with the innocent efficiency of someone who thought she was helping run a small import company that Elena had been the one to secure the scene while the rest of her team pursued Kozlov through the building's rear exit. She found herself alone with a 17-year-old girl who spoke broken English and kept asking where her father had gone. The girl's room was filled with university textbooks. She was studying international business and economics, dreaming of expanding what she thought was her family's legitimate trading operation. "My father, he is good man," the girl had said in halting English while Elena zip-tied her hands according to standard procedure. "He worked very hard to give me education. We help people get things they need." Elena had stood in that room, looking at textbooks and family photos, knowing that within the hour this girl would learn that her father was an international criminal whose activities had contributed to the deaths of hundreds of innocent people. The girl's entire world, her understanding of her family, her future plans, her fundamental beliefs about right and wrong was about to be destroyed by the truth. The mission had proceeded according to plan. Kozlov was apprehended, his network was dismantled, and significant quantities of dangerous weapons were prevented from reaching terrorist organizations. Elena's team received commendations for their efficiency and professionalism. But Elena couldn't forget the expression on that girl's face when she finally understood what her father had been doing. That incident might have been manageable on its own. Elena had learned to compartmentalize the collateral damage that inevitably accompanied special operations. But it was followed by a series of missions that seemed to require increasingly complex moral calculations. A rescue operation that saved 12 hostages but resulted in the deaths of 4 guards, who were probably just trying to earn money to feed their families. An assassination mission that eliminated a bomb maker but also destroyed the small clinic he had been secretly funding in his hometown. A reconnaissance operation that provided intelligence for a drone strike that killed its intended target along with 2 civilians who happened to be in the wrong place at the wrong time. Each mission was justified by the larger strategic picture. Each operation saved more lives than it cost. Each tactical decision was supported by intelligence assessments and approved by officers who understood the broader implications better than Elena ever could. But the cumulative weight of these moral compromises was becoming unbearable. The breaking point came during what should have been Elena's most straightforward assignment, providing security for a diplomat's daughter who was studying at a university in Morocco. The girl, Sarah Hendricks, was the 19-year-old daughter of the U.S. ambassador to Tunisia, and intelligence reports suggested that she might be targeted for kidnapping by extremist groups looking to leverage her father's position. Elena spent 6 weeks posing as a graduate student in Sarah's program, maintaining close surveillance while the young woman attended classes, socialized with friends, and lived the normal life of a college student abroad. Sarah was intelligent, idealistic, and passionate about international development work. She spoke 3 languages fluently, volunteered at local refugee assistance programs, and planned to dedicate her career to humanitarian aid. On a Thursday evening in November, Elena was maintaining her usual position in a cafe across from Sarah's apartment building when she noticed unusual activity in the area. 2 men in a vehicle that had appeared at various locations throughout the week were now parked with a clear view of the building's entrance. A 3rd individual was positioned on foot at the corner, pretending to read a newspaper while actually watching the street. Elena immediately activated her emergency communication protocols and began moving towards Sarah's building. But she was still half a block away when she saw Sarah emerge from the entrance, apparently heading toward her evening language class as she did every Tuesday and Thursday. The kidnapping attempt happened exactly as Elena's training had taught her to expect. The vehicle accelerated towards Sarah while the man on foot moved to cut off her escape route. It was a textbook operation that would have succeeded against any normal target, but Elena wasn't a normal security detail, and her response wasn't limited to calling for backup and hoping for the best. She reached Sarah before the kidnappers could secure her, eliminated 2 of the 3 attackers, and disabled the 3rd. The entire incident was over in less than 90 seconds. Sarah was unharmed. The diplomatic crisis was avoided, and Elena received official recognition for preventing an international incident. But during the debrief, Sarah had asked Elena a question that would haunt her for months afterward. "How many people have you killed?" Sarah had asked quietly, staring at Elena with a mixture of gratitude and horror. "I mean, in your career. How many people have died because of what you do?" Elena had given the standard response about classified information and operational security. But Sarah's question had forced her to confront a calculation she had been avoiding for years. Not just the direct casualties, the people she had personally killed in combat, but the broader impact of her actions. The weapons dealers whose operations she had disrupted, knowing that rival organizations would fill the void with probably worse consequences. The terrorist leaders she had eliminated, knowing that their replacements might be even more ruthless. The intelligence she had gathered that contributed to operations she would never know about, with consequences she could never track. Sarah Hendricks went on to complete her degree and began working for Doctors Without Borders in refugee camps across Africa. Elena received orders for her next assignment, a deep cover operation in Southeast Asia that would require her to spend at least 18 months infiltrating a human trafficking network, 2 weeks before she was scheduled to deploy. Elena submitted her request for transfer to inactive reserves. Captain Morrison had tried to convince her to reconsider. "Elena, you're one of the most effective operators in the community. You have the potential to reach the highest levels of Special Operations Command. Are you really going to walk away from all of that?" Elena had looked out the window of Morrison's office, watching young sailors conduct basic training drills on the parade ground below. "Ma'am, I became a SEAL because I wanted to protect people. But I'm starting to think that the best way for me to protect people might be to stop being a SEAL." The transition to civilian life had been more difficult than Elena had anticipated. She had spent 8 years in an environment where every decision was guided by clear mission parameters and chain of command structures. Suddenly, she was responsible for determining her own objectives and measuring her own success without the framework that had defined her adult life. The job at Naval Station Blackwater was supposed to be temporary, a way to earn income while she figured out what came next. Elena had assumed that working in a military environment would provide some comfort and familiarity while she adjusted to civilian employment. She hadn't expected to encounter people like Captain Thornfield, whose petty tyranny reminded her of everything she had hoped to leave behind about military culture. But Elena had made a promise to herself when she left active duty. She would never again use her special operations training unless innocent lives were in immediate danger. She would endure whatever harassment or humiliation civilian life brought her way, because the alternative was returning to a world where her skills were measured by her ability to kill efficiently and without question. That promise had sustained her through 3 months of Thornfield's escalating harassment. But promises, like patience, have limits. And Captain Thornfield was about to discover exactly what happened when you pushed a retired Navy SEAL beyond hers. The announcement came during the Monday morning all-hands meeting in Naval Station Blackwater's main auditorium. Commander Patricia Walsh, the base's executive officer, stood at the podium addressing nearly 800 personnel from various departments and divisions. The weekly briefings typically covered routine administrative matters, training schedules, and policy updates. But this Monday's agenda included something unprecedented. "Effective immediately," Commander Walsh announced, her voice carrying clearly through the auditorium sound system. "All base personnel will participate in the annual Combat Readiness Assessment. This includes not only active-duty military personnel, but also civilian contractors, support staff, and service workers." A murmur of surprise rippled through the assembled crowd. The Combat Readiness Assessment was usually limited to military personnel in operational roles. Including civilian workers was an unusual expansion of the program that caught many people off guard. Elena sat in the back row with the other food service workers, listening with growing unease as Commander Walsh continued her explanation. "This year's assessment has been expanded as part of a Department of Defense initiative to evaluate the overall security preparedness of military installations. Every person with base access will undergo basic fitness testing, emergency response evaluation, and marksmanship qualification." Mrs. Chun leaned over to whisper to Elena, "I haven't touched a rifle since basic training 25 years ago. This should be interesting." Elena remained silent, but her mind was already calculating the implications. The marksmanship qualification would require her to handle military weapons in front of base personnel, including officers who might recognize advanced shooting techniques. She had managed to maintain her anonymity for 3 months by avoiding any situation that might reveal her military background, but the mandatory assessment would make that impossible. Commander Walsh was explaining the logistics of the assessment program. Testing will be conducted over the next 2 weeks, with different departments scheduled on different days. Civilian personnel will complete their assessments this Friday, beginning at 0800 hours. Food service, maintenance, administrative support, and security contractors will all participate. Captain Thornfield was sitting in the front section with other department heads, and Elena could see him turning slightly to scan the civilian personnel section. When his gaze found her, his expression shifted into what could only be described as predatory satisfaction. He had been escalating his harassment campaign for weeks, and the prospect of watching Elena struggle through military assessments clearly appealed to him after the meeting. As personnel filed out of the auditorium, Elena overheard conversations that confirmed her worst fears about the upcoming assessment. The civilian workers were nervous about the physical requirements and terrified about the weapons testing. Most of them had minimal experience with firearms and were already dreading the public humiliation of failing to meet military standards. "I'm going to make a fool of myself," Maria Santos confided to the group as they walked back toward the cafeteria. "My husband tried to teach me to shoot once, and I couldn't hit the broadside of a barn." Jake Morrison was more philosophical about the situation. "Look, they know we're not soldiers. The standards for civilians have to be different. They're probably just looking for basic safety compliance and maybe hitting the target board somewhere." Elena hoped Jake was right, but her experience with military bureaucracy suggested otherwise. The assessment would likely use standard military qualification courses, with minimal accommodation for civilian participants. She would be expected to perform at the same level as everyone else, and any attempt to deliberately underperform would be obvious to trained observers. That afternoon, Captain Thornfield made his usual appearance at the lunch-serving line. But his demeanor was different, more animated, almost gleeful. He lingered longer than usual, making comments that seemed designed to build anticipation for Friday's assessment. "Well, lunch lady," he said loud enough for the surrounding personnel to hear. "I hear you'll be joining us for some real military training this week. Are you excited to show us what you're made of?" Elena continued serving food without acknowledgement, but Thornfield wasn't finished. He seemed energized by the prospect of watching her struggle through assessments designed for military personnel. "You know, I've been thinking about your little medical performance a few weeks ago," he continued, his tone conversational but carrying an undercurrent of malice. "It's interesting how some people can look competent in one area, but completely fall apart when they're outside their comfort zone." "Lieutenant." Chun was in line several people behind Thornfield and clearly uncomfortable with his behavior. But intervening would create a public confrontation with a superior officer. She settled for moving closer, hoping her presence might moderate his comments. "I run the advanced marksmanship program here," Thornfield announced, still addressing Elena but speaking to the broader audience. "I've seen thousands of people attempt military weapons qualification. The ones who think they know what they're doing usually perform worse than complete beginners. Overconfidence is dangerous on a firing range." Elena placed his meal on his tray with the same mechanical precision she brought to every interaction. Her complete lack of response only seemed to encourage Thornfield's anticipation for Friday's assessment. "The thing about weapons training," he continued, "is that it reveals character. You can't fake your way through marksmanship. Either you have the discipline and mental toughness required, or you don't. Friday should be very educational." The harassment continued daily throughout the week, with Thornfield making increasingly pointed comments about Elena's likely performance during the assessment. He seemed to relish the prospect of watching her fail publicly, treating Friday's testing as an opportunity to definitively prove her incompetence in front of the entire base. Other personnel began to take notice of Thornfield's behavior. The civilian workers rallied around Elena, offering encouragement and expressing outrage at the captain's obvious attempts to intimidate her. Several junior officers privately expressed disgust at their superior's conduct, though none were willing to challenge him directly. Dr. Foster approached Elena during Wednesday's lunch service with an offer that surprised everyone within earshot. "Elena, I know Friday's assessment has everyone nervous. If you'd like, I could arrange some practice time at the base's training range. We could work on basic safety procedures and familiarization." Elena looked up from the serving line for the first time in weeks, meeting Dr. Foster's eyes directly. "Thank you, ma'am, but that won't be necessary." Dr. Foster studied Elena's expression, clearly intrigued by her calm confidence. "Are you sure? The marksmanship portion can be challenging, even for people with military experience." "I'll be fine," Elena replied simply. Returning to her work, Dr. Foster lingered for a moment, her medical training allowing her to read subtle signs that others missed. Elena's body language didn't suggest anxiety or dread about the upcoming assessment. Instead, she radiated the kind of quiet confidence that came from absolute certainty about one's capabilities. Thursday evening, Elena sat alone in her small apartment off base, cleaning and inspecting the personal gear she hadn't touched in 3 months. Her duty boots were still broken imperfectly, her old military watch kept perfect time, and the muscle memory of weapons handling remained intact despite her months away from active duty. She had hoped to avoid this moment, to maintain her anonymity and complete her transition to civilian life, without ever again demonstrating the skills that had defined her military career. But Captain Thornfield's harassment campaign had made that impossible. Friday's assessment would force her to choose between continued humiliation and revealing abilities that would raise questions she wasn't prepared to answer. Elena made her decision while sitting in the darkness of her apartment, her retired SEAL trident resting on the table beside her. She would participate in Friday's assessment exactly as required, performing to the best of her abilities without consideration for the consequences. If Captain Thornfield wanted to see what she was made of, she would show him. But once he knew the truth about Elena Vasquez, there would be no going back to the comfortable anonymity of being dismissed as just another civilian worker. Friday would change everything, and Elena suspected that Captain Thornfield had no idea what he was about to unleash. Friday morning arrived with the crisp clarity of a Southern California winter day. Elena reported to the base's main training facility at 0745 hours, 15 minutes before the scheduled start time for civilian personnel assessments. She wore standard-issue workout clothes that she had purchased from the base exchange: black shorts, gray navy t-shirt, and her old military-issue boots that she had carefully cleaned the night before. The training facility was a sprawling complex that included obstacle courses, fitness testing areas, and multiple firing ranges designed for everything from basic pistol qualification to advanced sniper training. Elena hadn't set foot in this section of the base during her 3 months of employment, but the familiar sounds and smells immediately triggered memories of countless hours spent in similar facilities throughout her military career. Approximately 40 civilian personnel had assembled in the main staging area, representing every non-military department on the base. Elena recognized most of them: cafeteria workers, maintenance staff, administrative assistants, security contractors, and various support personnel who kept Naval Station Blackwater functioning behind the scenes. The mood was a mixture of nervous anticipation and resigned dread, with most participants clearly uncomfortable about being subjected to military-style assessments. Master Chief Petty Officer Robert "Tank" Coleman was overseeing the civilian assessments, a 30-year Navy veteran whose intimidating physical presence masked a surprisingly patient teaching style. Elena knew his type: senior enlisted personnel who understood that effective training required building confidence rather than destroying it. Coleman had probably volunteered for this assignment, specifically to ensure that civilian participants were treated with appropriate consideration. Good morning, everyone, Coleman announced, his voice carrying easily across the assembled group. I know this isn't what most of you signed up for when you took jobs on this base, but we're going to get through this together. The goal isn't to make you into Navy SEALs. It's to ensure that everyone who works here can contribute to base security if necessary. Elena positioned herself toward the back of the group, hoping to avoid attracting attention during the initial briefing. But her attempt at anonymity was undermined by the arrival of Captain Thornfield, who had apparently decided to personally observe the civilian assessments, despite having no official role in the testing process. "Master Chief," Thornfield called out as he approached the group, "I hope you're planning to maintain full military standards for this assessment. We can't afford to lower expectations just because we're dealing with civilian personnel." Coleman's expression remained neutral, but Elena detected a subtle tension in his body language that suggested he wasn't entirely comfortable with Thornfield's presence. "Sir, the assessment protocols are designed to evaluate civilian capabilities against appropriate standards. We'll be thorough but fair." Thornfield's gaze swept across the assembled civilians until it found Elena. "I'm particularly interested in seeing how some of our more confident personnel perform under pressure. It's important to separate genuine capability from lucky guesses." Elena felt the attention of other participants shifting toward her, and she realized that Thornfield's weeks of harassment had made her something of a celebrity among the civilian workers. They knew she was his primary target, and many of them were probably hoping to see her succeed just to spite him. The assessment began with basic physical fitness testing, push-ups, sit-ups, and a timed mile run. Elena had maintained her conditioning during her months of civilian employment, running every morning before work and using bodyweight exercises in her apartment. She completed the fitness requirements easily, though she was careful not to dramatically exceed the standards in ways that might raise questions about her background. Maria Santos struggled through the push-ups, managing 12 repetitions before her arms gave out. Jake Morrison's injured leg limited his running performance, but he pushed through the mile with determined persistence. Mrs. Chun surprised everyone by completing all requirements with the efficiency of someone who had maintained her fitness. Long after leaving active duty, Elena finished her mile run in 6:47. A respectable time that placed her in the top quartile without being so exceptional as to draw unwanted attention. She noticed Master Chief Coleman making notes on his evaluation clipboard, and she hoped her performance was registering as competent civilian rather than suspiciously well-conditioned. The emergency response portion of the assessment was next, involving basic first aid scenarios and evacuation procedures. Elena's medical training from her SEAL background made this section almost trivially easy, but she had to consciously slow down her responses to avoid demonstrating the kind of advanced trauma care knowledge that would have been impossible to explain. When presented with a simulated casualty suffering from severe bleeding, Elena applied pressure to the correct arterial points and stabilized the patient efficiently. But she made sure to verbalize her decision-making process as if she were recalling basic first aid training rather than operating from muscle memory, developed through treating real combat casualties. "Good work, Vasquez," Master Chief Coleman commented as she completed the scenario. "You seem comfortable with emergency medical procedures." Elena nodded politely. "I took some first aid courses when I was younger, Master Chief." But Captain Thornfield had been watching closely, and he stepped forward with obvious interest. "Master Chief, I think we should note that Ms. Vasquez has demonstrated some unusual medical knowledge in recent weeks. Perhaps her emergency response evaluation should be more challenging than the standard civilian scenarios." Coleman looked between Thornfield and Elena, clearly uncomfortable with the suggestion. "Sir, the assessment protocols are standardized for good reason. We're evaluating basic emergency preparedness, not advanced medical training." "I understand that," Thornfield replied, his tone carrying the subtle authority of rank. "But if someone has demonstrated capabilities beyond basic first aid, shouldn't we verify those capabilities? For base security purposes?" Elena realized that Thornfield was trying to use the assessment as an opportunity to publicly humiliate her by setting expectations she couldn't meet. He wanted to force her into situations where her lack of advanced medical training would be exposed, confirming his narrative that her earlier emergency response had been nothing more than luck. "Master Chief," Elena said quietly, "if Captain Thornfield wants me to attempt advanced scenarios, I'm willing to participate." Coleman studied her for a moment, then looked at his evaluation sheets. "Very well. Vasquez, you'll complete the advanced trauma scenario designed for Medical Corps personnel. The advanced scenario involved a simulated casualty with multiple injuries, severe chest trauma, potential spinal injury, and arterial bleeding from a leg wound. It was the kind of complex emergency that would challenge experienced medical personnel and could easily overwhelm someone with only basic first aid training. Elena approached the scenario with the same calm efficiency she had brought to real combat casualties in Afghanistan and Syria. She established airway security, stabilized the spine, controlled bleeding using proper tourniquets, and prepared the patient for evacuation while maintaining constant communication with simulated medical support. Her performance was flawless. Master Chief Coleman stood silently for several seconds after Elena completed the scenario, his expression unreadable. The other civilian participants had gathered around to watch, and they erupted in spontaneous applause when she finished. "Outstanding," Coleman said finally. "That was textbook trauma response. Where did you say you learned medical procedures?" Elena was quiet for a moment, aware that her performance had crossed the line from impressively competent civilian into obviously professional level training. She could feel Captain Thornfield's stare, and she knew that her response would determine how much scrutiny she faced going forward. "I had some medical training during my previous military service," she said simply. "What was your MOS?" Coleman asked, using the military term for job classification. 68W, Elena replied, giving the Army designation for combat medic rather than revealing her actual Navy Special Operations background. Coleman nodded approvingly. "That explains it. Combat medics receive excellent trauma training." But Elena noticed that Captain Thornfield wasn't satisfied with her explanation. His expression suggested he was already planning to verify her claimed military background, and she realized that her attempt to provide a plausible cover story might have created more problems than it solved. The marksmanship assessment was scheduled for last, and Elena knew it would be the most challenging portion to navigate. Unlike medical training, which could theoretically be explained by various civilian or military backgrounds, advanced shooting skills were much more difficult to rationalize without revealing specialized training. As the group moved toward the firing range, Elena caught sight of her reflection in the training facility's windows. For the first time in months, she looked like what she actually was, a highly trained military professional moving with the unconscious confidence of someone completely comfortable in a combat environment. Transformation was subtle but unmistakable, and Elena realized that she had crossed a line from which there would be no return. Captain Thornfield had pushed her into revealing capabilities that would inevitably lead to questions about her true background. The marksmanship test would either confirm her cover story about being a former Army medic, or it would expose her as something far more dangerous than anyone at Naval Station Blackwater had imagined. The marksmanship range at Naval Station Blackwater was a state-of-the-art facility designed to accommodate everything from basic pistol qualification to advanced precision shooting. Elena walked onto the range with the other civilian personnel, immediately cataloging details that most people would never notice: wind direction indicators, elevation markers, the subtle variations in lighting that could affect accuracy at different distances. Master Chief Coleman had arranged the civilian participants into groups of 5, with each group rotating through different firing positions and weapon systems. The standard qualification course involved shooting at targets positioned at 25, 50, and 100 meters using both pistol and rifle platforms. For civilian personnel, the passing standards were considerably lower than military requirements, but the weapons and procedures were identical to what active duty personnel used. Elena was assigned to the 3rd group, which meant she would observe 2 complete cycles before her turn. She watched carefully as the first civilians attempted the qualification course, noting their struggles with basic weapon handling, sight alignment, and trigger control. Most of them had little or no experience with military firearms, and their performance reflected that inexperience. Maria Santos managed to hit the target board at 25 meters with roughly half her shots, missing completely at longer distances. Jake Morrison's military background showed in his weapon handling, but his injured leg affected his stability, and his accuracy suffered accordingly. Mrs. Chin surprised everyone by performing competently at all distances, confirming Elena's suspicion that the food service supervisor had more military experience than she typically discussed. Captain Thornfield had positioned himself at the range control tower, where he could observe all participants while maintaining a clear view of Elena's eventual performance. He had brought a spotting scope and appeared to be taking detailed notes, treating the civilian assessment as a personal research project rather than routine base training. 2nd group, "Move to the firing line," Master Chief Coleman announced. "Remember, safety is the priority. Follow all range commands immediately and completely." Elena noticed that several junior officers had gathered to observe the civilian assessments, drawn by curiosity about how non-military personnel would perform with military weapons. Lieutenant Sarah Chun was among the observers, and Elena detected genuine concern in her expression, not about Elena's likely performance, but about Captain Thornfield's obvious intention to use the assessment as a harassment opportunity. The 2nd group's performance was similar to the first: competent effort with limited success at longer distances. Elena used the time to study the weapons they would be using: standard issue M9 pistols and M4 carbines, both platforms she had trained with extensively during her SEAL career. The rifles were configured with basic iron sights rather than advanced optics, which would make precision shooting more challenging, but was well within her capabilities. 3rd group, "Approach the firing line," Coleman commanded. "Vasquez, you'll be shooting from position 3. Elena stepped up to the designated firing position, immediately falling into the familiar routine of range preparation. She checked the weapon's condition, verified the safety mechanisms, and adjusted the stock length to accommodate her build. Her movements were economical and professional, drawing approving nods from Master Chief Coleman, but also attracting increased attention from the observing officers. "The qualification course consists of 40 rounds total," Coleman explained to Elena's group. 20 rounds pistol, 20 rounds rifle. You'll engage targets at 25, 50, and 100 meters. Civilian passing standard is 60% accuracy overall. Elena knew that 60% was a deliberately low standard, designed to ensure that most civilian participants could achieve a passing score with reasonable effort. For someone with her background, achieving 100% accuracy would be routine. But such performance would immediately raise questions about her. Claimed training as an Army medic. "Load and make." "Ready," Coleman commanded. Elena inserted the magazine into her M9 pistol and chambered a round with movements so smooth they appeared choreographed. She had performed this exact sequence thousands of times during her military career, and the muscle memory was still perfect. Despite months away from active duty, the 25-meter targets were large and clearly visible, designed to build confidence for participants who might be intimidated by the weapons or the range environment. Elena adopted a modified Weaver stance that provided excellent stability while appearing to be basic shooting form that any competent trainer might have taught her. Commence firing. Elena's first shot struck the target's center ring with a precision that was immediately obvious to everyone watching. Her second shot struck within inches of the first. By her fifth shot, it was clear that she was grouping her rounds with a consistency that went far beyond basic marksmanship training. Master Chief Coleman was watching through binoculars, and Elena could see his expression shifting from professional observation to genuine interest. Captain Thornfield had abandoned his clipboard and was now focused entirely on Elena's performance through his spotting scope. "Cease fire. Move to the 50-meter line," Coleman announced. The 50-meter targets were smaller and more challenging, requiring greater precision and better trigger control. Elena adjusted her stance slightly to accommodate the increased distance, but her shooting rhythm remained exactly the same: controlled breathing, sight alignment, smooth trigger press. Follow dash through dot. Her shots at 50 meters were as precise as her 25-meter performance. She was placing rounds within a grouping that would have been impressive for active-duty military personnel, let alone a civilian worker claiming basic medic training. "Outstanding shooting, Vasquez," Coleman called out. "Where did you train marksmanship during your Army service?" Elena realized that her performance was attracting exactly the kind of attention she had hoped to avoid. "Basic rifle marksmanship during 8, Master Chief. Some additional training at my first duty station." It was a plausible answer that any former Army medic might give, but Elena could see that several observers weren't entirely convinced. Her shooting was too consistent, too professional, for someone whose military training had focused on medical rather than combat skills. "Final relay, 100-meter targets," Coleman announced. "This is where we separate the shooters from the pretenders." The 100-meter qualification was typically the most challenging portion for civilian participants. The targets were significantly smaller, environmental factors became more important, and the increased distance amplified any flaws in shooting technique or weapon handling. Elena transitioned to the M4 carbine, quickly adjusting the weapon to her preferred configuration. She had used similar rifles during countless operations, and this particular model was actually less advanced than the weapons she had trained with during her SEAL career. She settled into a supported prone position that provided maximum stability while appearing to be standard shooting form. Through the iron sights, the 100-meter target was clearly visible, and Elena automatically calculated the minor adjustments needed for wind, drift, and elevation. Her first shot struck the target's center ring. Her second shot struck within millimeters of the first. By her 10th shot, Elena had achieved what experienced range instructors recognized as a perfect score. With all rounds within the highest scoring ring, the range had grown noticeably quieter as Elena's performance became impossible to ignore. Even the civilian participants in other groups had stopped their own activities to watch her systematic destruction of the targets. "Cease fire. Clear all weapons," Coleman commanded. But his voice carried a different tone than it had during the earlier portions of the assessment. Elena cleared her rifle and stepped back from the firing line, aware that every person on the range was now staring at her with expressions ranging from amazement to suspicion. She had just demonstrated shooting skills that were clearly far beyond anything that basic Army medic training could explain. "Master Chief." Coleman approached Elena with his evaluation clipboard, but instead of writing scores, he was studying her with the analytical gaze of a career military professional who recognized advanced training when he saw it. "Vasquez," he said quietly, That was some of the finest marksmanship I've seen from anyone, military or civilian. Your groupings at 100 meters were tighter than most of our active duty personnel achieve. Elena remained silent, knowing that anything she said would either be a lie or a revelation that would completely blow her cover. Captain Thornfield was climbing down from the observation tower, his expression a mixture of confusion and anger. He had expected Elena's performance to confirm his narrative about her incompetence, but instead he had just witnessed a demonstration of skills that suggested she was far more than she appeared to be. "Master Chief," Thornfield called out as he approached Elena's firing position, "I'd like to review the target results personally." Coleman handed over the targets, and Thornfield examined them with the spotting scope. His face grew increasingly pale as he studied the precise groupings that Elena had achieved at each distance. "This level of marksmanship," Thornfield said slowly, "doesn't come from basic Army training. These are precision shooting skills that require advanced instruction and extensive practice." Elena knew that her carefully constructed cover story was unraveling, but she had reached the point where continuing the deception would be more dangerous than revealing at least part of the truth. "Sir," Elena said quietly, "some Army medics receive additional combat training depending on their assignments." It was still technically a truthful statement, though it omitted the crucial detail that Elena's additional training had taken place at the most elite special operations school in the world. Thornfield studied her for a long moment, clearly recognizing that he was missing important information about Elena's background. "I think we need to have a more detailed conversation about your military service, Ms. Vasquez." Elena nodded, knowing that her months of anonymity at Naval Station Blackwater were about to end. But she also realized that Captain Thornfield had no idea what kind of conversation he was about to have, or what he might learn about the quiet cafeteria worker he'd been harassing for the past 3 months. The confrontation Elena had been dreading for 3 months finally arrived on the following Tuesday. During the peak lunch rush when the cafeteria was packed with over 600 personnel, she was working the main serving line, ladling portions of beef stew and mashed potatoes with the same methodical efficiency she had maintained since her first day at Naval Station Blackwater. The weekend had passed without incident following Friday's marksmanship assessment, but Elena could feel the weight of increased scrutiny from various quarters of the base. Captain Thornfield had spent the intervening days conducting what he undoubtedly considered a thorough investigation into Elena's background. He had made inquiries with personnel records, contacted Army databases about former medics with her supposed qualifications, and even reached out to colleagues at other installations who might have information about advanced marksmanship training for medical personnel. Elena suspected that his research had produced more questions than answers, and that uncertainty was making him increasingly agitated. The captain's behavior during his daily lunch visits had taken on a new intensity. Instead of his usual condescending comments about her competence, he now studied Elena with the focused attention of someone trying to solve a puzzle. He would linger at the serving line longer than necessary, asking pointed questions about her previous assignments and training that Elena deflected with polite non-answers. On Tuesday, Thornfield arrived for lunch 15 minutes earlier than usual, accompanied by Lieutenant Colonel Marcus Webb from the base's intelligence division. Webb was a career officer with over 20 years of experience in personnel security and counterintelligence, and his presence immediately elevated the tension in the cafeteria. Elena recognized his type: methodical, thorough, and completely uninterested in anything except facts and verification. "Vasquez," Thornfield called out as he approached the serving line, his voice carrying an edge of authority that made nearby conversations pause. "Lieutenant Colonel Webb would like to ask you some questions about your military background." Elena continued serving food, aware that dozens of personnel were now watching the interaction with growing interest. News of her marksmanship performance had spread throughout the base over the weekend, and many people were curious about the quiet cafeteria worker who had apparently been hiding significant military skills. "Ma'am," Webb said formally, "we're conducting a routine verification of personnel records. Could you provide your complete service history, including units of assignment and specialized training?" Elena placed a portion of beef stew on a tray and looked up to meet Webb's gaze directly. "Sir, I served 4 years as a 68 West with the 82nd Airborne Division. Basic training at Fort Benning, advanced individual training at Fort Sam Houston, then assignment to Fort Bragg for the remainder of my enlistment." It was a carefully constructed lie that would be difficult to verify immediately, but would eventually be exposed if Webb conducted a thorough investigation. Elena was buying time while hoping that the situation wouldn't escalate to the point where her real background would be discovered. Webb made notes on a small pad. "The marksmanship skills you demonstrated Friday are exceptional for someone with medic training. Can you explain how you developed those capabilities?" "Additional training opportunities were available at Fort Bragg, sir. I took advantage of them when possible." Thornfield stepped closer to the serving line, his expression growing more aggressive. "That's a very convenient answer, Vasquez. But I've been checking with contacts at Bragg, and nobody remembers any medics receiving the kind of advanced marksmanship training that would produce your level of performance." Elena felt the familiar tension that preceded violent confrontation, the subtle shift in atmospheric pressure that occurred when a situation was about to escalate beyond the point of peaceful resolution. She had experienced this sensation countless times during her SEAL career, usually in situations where her survival depended on making correct tactical decisions within seconds. "Sir," Elena said quietly, "I completed my service honorably and received an honorable discharge. My performance during Friday's assessment was within acceptable parameters for the evaluation." "Acceptable parameters?" Thornfield's voice was rising, drawing attention from throughout the cafeteria. "You achieved perfect scores that would be impressive for our advanced marksmanship instructors. That level of precision doesn't come from weekend training courses." Lieutenant Colonel Webb was observing the exchange with professional interest, clearly studying Elena's responses for signs of deception or nervousness. Elena maintained her composure, but she could see that Webb was beginning to suspect that her claimed background didn't match her demonstrated capabilities. The situation deteriorated rapidly when Thornfield decided to escalate his confrontation beyond professional inquiry into personal attack. "You know what I think, Vasquez? I think you're lying about your entire background. I think you're hiding something significant, and I'm going to find out what it is." Elena continued working, serving portions to the growing line of personnel who were now openly watching the confrontation. Her silence only seemed to inflame Field's anger further. "Look at me when I'm talking to you," Thornfield demanded, his voice loud enough to carry throughout the immediate area. "I'm a captain in the United States Navy, and when I ask you a question, you will give me a complete and honest answer." Elena finished serving the current customer and looked up at Thornfield with the same neutral expression she had maintained throughout 3 months of harassment. "Sir, I've answered your questions to the best of my ability. What happened next would be analyzed and discussed by base personnel for months afterward." Captain Thornfield, frustrated by Elena's refusal to be intimidated and convinced that she was lying about her background, made a decision that would change his career and his life. He reached across the serving line and grabbed Elena's wrist, attempting to force her to face him directly. The moment Thornfield's hand made contact with Elena's arm, 8 years of special operations training activated like a switch being thrown. Her response was instantaneous, automatic, and completely disproportionate to the situation, exactly as she had been conditioned to react when someone attempted to restrain Her through physical force, Elena's free hand moved in a precise arc that struck Thornfield's wrist at the exact pressure point needed to break his grip while simultaneously stepping back to create distance. The movement was so fast and smooth that most observers didn't initially understand what had happened. Thornfield found himself stumbling forward, off balance, his hand numb from the nerve strike that Elena had delivered with surgical precision. But Elena's training hadn't just taught her to break free from restraint, it had taught her to neutralize threats completely and immediately. Before Thornfield could recover his balance, Elena's hand was moving again, this time toward his throat in the kind of strike that would have ended the confrontation permanently. She stopped herself less than an inch from Thornfield's neck, her hand frozen in position as she fought against muscle memory that wanted to complete the sequence. For a frozen moment, the entire cafeteria was silent as hundreds of personnel witnessed a civilian food worker demonstrating combat techniques that were clearly far beyond anything taught in basic military training. Thornfield staggered backward, his face pale with shock and pain from the nerve strike. He was staring at Elena with an expression of complete bewilderment, finally understanding that he had just attempted to physically restrain someone whose capabilities were far beyond his comprehension. Jesus Christ, Lieutenant Colonel Webb breathed, his professional composure cracking as he recognized the precision and lethality of the techniques Elena had just demonstrated. Those are special operations combat methods. Elena stood perfectly still behind the serving line, her hands still positioned in the striking pose, aware that she had just revealed training that could only have come from the military's most elite units. The cafeteria remained absolutely silent as hundreds of personnel tried to process what they had just witnessed. Captain Thornfield was holding his wrist, his face cycling through expressions of pain, shock, and growing realization. "What the hell are you?" he asked quietly. Elena slowly lowered her hand and resumed her position behind the serving line. But the transformation was complete and irreversible. The quiet, unassuming cafeteria worker was gone, replaced by someone whose every movement now radiated the controlled lethality of advanced military training. "Sir," Elena said quietly, her voice carrying a different quality than anyone had heard before, "you should not have touched me." The understatement hung in the air like a challenge, and Elena knew that her months of anonymity at Naval Station Blackwater had just ended in the most dramatic way possible. Captain Thornfield had finally learned what kind of person he had been harassing for 3 months, but the knowledge had come at a cost that neither of them had anticipated. The silence in the cafeteria stretched for nearly 30 seconds, an eternity in a room filled with 600 military personnel who had just witnessed something that defied explanation. Elena stood behind the serving line with her hand still positioned where it had stopped, inches from Captain Thornfield's throat, while he staggered backward, clutching his wrist and staring at her with a mixture of pain and dawning comprehension. Lieutenant Colonel Webb was the first to break the spell. As an intelligence officer with 2 decades of experience, he had seen enough classified briefings and personnel files to recognize the level of training that Elena had just displayed. The precision of her defensive movement, the speed of her counterattack, and most importantly, the control she had demonstrated in stopping herself before delivering what would have been a lethal blow. These were capabilities that belonged to a very small and very exclusive community within the military. "Everyone remain calm," Webb announced, his voice carrying the authority of rank and experience. "Return to your meals and normal activities. This incident is concluded." The cafeteria slowly began to return to life, though the conversations were muted and every eye remained focused on the serving line where Elena stood motionless. Personnel were pulling out phones to text friends and colleagues, ensuring that news of the confrontation would spread throughout Naval Station Blackwater within hours. Webb approached Elena's position with the measured steps of someone who understood he might be dealing with a far more dangerous individual than anyone had realized. "Ma'am, I think we need to continue this conversation in a more private setting." Elena nodded and began removing her hairnet and apron with movements that were now clearly recognizable as military precise. Every gesture was economical, purposeful, and carried out with the kind of unconscious efficiency that came from years of training where wasted motion could mean death. Captain Thornfield was still holding his wrist, flexing his fingers to restore feeling to his hand. The nerve strike that Elena had delivered was designed to cause temporary paralysis without permanent damage, a technique used for prisoner control rather than elimination. "Webb," he said quietly, "that was not basic Army medic training." "No, sir, it was not," Webb replied, studying Elena with the analytical gaze of a professional intelligence officer. "Ma'am, would you accompany me to my office? We have some questions that require immediate answers." Elena stepped out from behind the serving line, and the transformation was complete. Without the civilian work clothes, and surrounded by the controlled chaos of the cafeteria, she moved with the fluid confidence of someone completely comfortable in military environments. Her posture was different, her awareness was heightened, and her entire demeanor radiated the kind of quiet competence that marked elite military personnel. Mrs. Chun approached cautiously, clearly confused by the rapid escalation of events. "Elena, are you all right? Do you need me to contact anyone?" Elena turned to her supervisor with an expression that was both apologetic and resigned. "Mrs. Chun, I think my employment here just ended. I'm sorry for any problems this has caused." "Employment ended?" Mrs. Chun looked between Elena and the officers. "What are you talking about? Captain Thornfield grabbed you inappropriately. You defended yourself. That's not grounds for termination." Lieutenant Colonel Webb intervened before the conversation could continue. "Ma'am, this is now a personnel security matter that requires immediate attention. Ms. Vasquez will be unavailable for the remainder of the day while we conduct our investigation." As they walked toward the cafeteria exit, Elena could feel hundreds of eyes following their progress. She had managed to maintain her anonymity for 3 months, but 30 seconds of reflexive action had destroyed her carefully constructed civilian identity. The quiet food service worker was gone forever, replaced by someone whose capabilities would now be the subject of intense scrutiny and speculation. Captain Thornfield followed several steps behind, still flexing his hand and wearing the expression of someone who had just learned a very expensive lesson about making assumptions. His 3 months of harassment had been based on the comfortable belief that Elena was a powerless civilian worker who could be intimidated without consequence. The revelation that she possessed advanced combat training that suggested connections to special operations forces had fundamentally altered the power dynamic between them. Lieutenant Colonel Webb's office was located in the base's intelligence complex, a secure building that required special clearances for access. Elena noticed the security measures as they walked through the corridor's biometric scanners, armed guards, and a kind of compartmentalized layout that was designed to protect classified information. She had worked in similar facilities during her SEAL career, and the familiar environment triggered memories of briefings, debriefings, and the kind of conversations that could determine the course of military operations. Webb's office was spartanly furnished with standard government furniture, but the walls were covered with photographs that told the story of a distinguished military career. Elena recognized several of the locations: Afghanistan, Iraq, Somalia, and noticed commendations that indicated Webb had served in roles that required top-secret clearances and extensive background investigations. "Please have a seat," Webb said, gesturing toward a chair positioned across from his desk. "Captain Thornfield, you may remain if Ms. Vasquez has no objection." Elena settled into the chair with perfect posture, her hands resting comfortably on the armrests in a position that suggested alertness without tension. "I have no objection to Captain Thornfield's presence." "Sir." Thornfield took a seat against the far wall, still nursing his wrist and watching Elena with the wary respect of someone who had just discovered that their target was far more dangerous than anticipated. The casual arrogance that had characterized his behavior toward Elena was completely gone, replaced by the careful attention of someone who understood he had made a serious miscalculation. Webb opened a manila folder and removed several documents. "Ms. Vasquez, let's start with some basic questions. You claim to be a former Army medic with service at Fort Bragg. We've conducted preliminary checks of those records, and we can't find any personnel files that match your claimed service history." Elena had expected this moment from the day she accepted the food service position. Her cover story had been designed to provide plausible explanations for her medical and physical capabilities while avoiding the kind of detailed background check that would reveal her true military history. But the combat techniques she had just demonstrated were far beyond anything that could be explained by conventional Army training. "Sir," Elena said quietly, "my actual military service involved classified assignments that required specialized training. The cover story I provided was designed to protect operational security." Webb leaned back in his chair, clearly recognizing the language that indicated involvement in special operations. "What was your actual military occupational specialty?" Elena was quiet for a moment, understanding that her answer would determine how the rest of this conversation proceeded. She could continue to maintain operational security and refuse to provide details about her SEAL background. But the demonstration in the cafeteria had already revealed capabilities that would be impossible to explain without admitting to advanced training. "Special operations, sir. Naval Special Warfare." The words hung in the air like a challenge. Webb's expression didn't change, but Elena noticed a subtle shift in his posture that indicated he was now dealing with someone whose background was far more significant than he had initially suspected. Captain Thornfield's face had gone completely pale. "Naval Special Warfare," he repeated slowly. "You're telling me that you're a Navy SEAL?" Elena met his gaze directly for the first time since the confrontation in the cafeteria. "I was a Navy SEAL, sir. I transferred to inactive reserves 8 months ago and took this position while determining my future career direction." Thornfield sank back in his chair, the full implications of Elena's revelation finally hitting him. For 3 months, he had been systematically harassing one of the most elite warriors in the United States military. He had mocked her capabilities, questioned her competence, and finally attempted to physically restrain someone whose training had prepared her to eliminate armed enemies in close combat. "Jesus Christ," he whispered. "I had no idea." Elena's expression remained neutral, but there was something in her eyes that suggested she was evaluating Thornfield with the same analytical precision she had once applied to enemy targets. "Sir, ignorance of someone's background doesn't excuse harassment or inappropriate physical contact." Webb was taking notes, clearly understanding that this situation had implications far beyond a simple workplace dispute. "Ms. Vasquez, what was your last assignment before transitioning to reserves?" "Classified, sir. I can provide my service record through official channels if required, but the specific details of my assignments remain protected by operational security protocols." "Understood." Webb closed his folder and studied Elena with the expression of someone who was rapidly recalculating his assessment of the situation. "Ms. Vasquez, I think we need to discuss your current status and future plans. Naval Station Blackwater has positions that might be more appropriate for someone with your background and capabilities." Elena shook her head. "Sir, I appreciate the offer, but I left active duty for personal reasons that haven't changed." I'm not interested in returning to operational roles. Then what do you want? Thornfield asked, his voice barely above a whisper. Elena turned to look at him again, and this time her expression carried the weight of 3 months of accumulated frustration and professional discipline. I wanted to serve food and be left alone while I figured out what came next in my life. You made that impossible. The simplicity of her answer seemed to hit Thornfield harder than any accusation or threat could have. Elena had never wanted recognition, revenge, or vindication. She had simply wanted the anonymity necessary to process her transition from one of the military's most demanding careers to civilian life. "Ma'am," Webb said carefully, "what would you like to see happen as a result of today's incident?" Elena was quiet for a long moment, considering her options. She could file formal complaints that would likely end Thornfield's career. Or she could request transfer to another position. Or she could simply walk away from Naval Station Blackwater entirely. "Sir, I would like Captain Thornfield to understand that harassment is inappropriate, regardless of the target's background or perceived status. And I would like to return to work tomorrow morning with the understanding that I will be treated with the same basic respect afforded to any other base employee." It was a remarkably generous response from someone who had endured months of systematic humiliation. And both officers recognized it as such. Thornfield stood up slowly, his face reflecting a mixture of shame, relief, and newfound respect. "Ms. Vasquez, I owe you an apology that goes far beyond what happened today. My behavior toward you has been unprofessional and inappropriate, and it will not continue." Elena nodded acknowledgement of his apology, but her expression remained neutral. "Thank you, sir." As they prepared to leave Webb's office, the lieutenant colonel had one final question. "Ms. Vasquez, are you planning to remain in food service permanently?" Elena smiled for the first time since the confrontation began, a genuine expression that transformed her entire face. "Sir, I'm discovering that there are many ways to serve, and some of them don't require carrying a weapon." 3 days later, Elena was back at her position behind the serving line, ladling portions and maintaining the cafeteria with the same methodical efficiency she had always demonstrated. But everything had changed. Personnel approached her with obvious respect. Conversations paused when she entered rooms, and she found herself being consulted on various matters by base leadership who had suddenly discovered they had a former SEAL working in their cafeteria. Captain Thornfield still came through the lunch line daily, but his behavior was completely different. He thanked Elena politely for her service, made no unnecessary comments, and treated her with the professional courtesy he should have shown from the beginning. Elena had found something she hadn't expected in her transition to civilian life, the understanding that her greatest strength wasn't her ability to eliminate enemies, but her capacity to maintain dignity and professionalism under impossible circumstances. She had learned that sometimes the most important battles were won not through violence, but through the quiet demonstration of character that inspired others to be better than they thought possible. The food service position was no longer temporary. Elena had discovered her new mission, teaching by example that true strength didn't require recognition, and that the most effective warriors were often the ones who never needed to fight. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.